If you have got a clematis out there that just sits and sulks, a few thin stems, one shy flower, all its color stranded way up at the top, where the birds get a better look at it than you do, then pull up a chair, because I am going to change how you see that plant. You have seen the videos, 15 tricks, make it grow 3 times faster. You won't believe number 6. So here is the honest truth, friend to friend. Before we start, no trick on earth makes a plant grow 3 times faster out of thin air. That number is somebody selling you something. But what is real is better than the promise. A slow clematis is almost never a plant that needs more. It is a plant with one broken lever. Find the right lever and pull it, and the change is so fast it looks like you cheated. So today is not a pile of random tips. It is a ladder. 15 levers, stacked from the one that moves the whole plant down to the one they advertise the loudest, which I will just tell you now, sits at the very bottom. The strongest things you can do are free. They are in your hands, and nobody makes a dime selling them. That is exactly why nobody told you. Watch to number 6, because number 6 stops people in their tracks. It is the flower trick. It costs nothing. It feels completely backwards, and it is the closest thing to magic I know for a clematis. This is your one video, 15 levers, top to bottom, and by the end, you will have a clematis you actually have to keep up with. Let's get into it. We start at the top of the ladder with the lever that moves everything, and it sounds the most boring. Water. Stay with me, because there is a mechanism here nobody explains. A stem does not lengthen because you fed it. It lengthens because each little cell fills with water and stretches, like a balloon. That is cell expansion, and it is mostly water. So the very first thing that stops when a clematis gets thirsty is not the flowers, it is growth itself. The plant hits the brakes to save water long before you would ever see it wilt. A clematis that is a little dry, a little too often, spends all summer with its foot on the brake. It lives. It just does not run. Here is where kind, attentive gardeners go wrong out of pure love. A little splash from the hose every evening feels caring, but it only wets the top inch. And that teaches the roots to stay up high chasing the daily drink, right where the sun bakes them. You have raised a shallow-rooted plant that panics the day you skip. Instead, water deep and seldom. A long, slow soak, a bucket or two, poured slow so it sinks, about twice a week in a dry spell, and nothing in between. When the top few inches dry out, the roots do the one thing you want. They dive. And a deep-rooted clematis finds its own water, shrugs off a heat wave, and pours its energy up into stems instead of into worrying. You are not feeding it when you water like this. You are deciding, once and for all, how deep the engine sits. Number 2 follows straight from number 1, and it is a 5-minute job that pays you back for 20 years. If deep roots are the goal, you want the water arriving down where the roots are, not sitting on the surface feeding weeds and steaming off by noon. So sink a delivery pipe next to the crown, a length of old drain pipe, or a plastic bottle with the bottom cut off and the cap left off, anything that makes a straight shot down. Set the open bottom about 8 or 10 inches deep, near the main roots, with the top poking up an inch or two. Drop in a handful of gravel so it does not clog. Now when you water, you pour into the pipe, and it goes straight to the roots, no runoff, no puddle against the stems, no wet crown inviting rot. On a blistering afternoon, that pipe is the difference between water that reaches the plant and water that evaporates off the mulch. Notice the pattern, because the pattern is the whole video. The most powerful moves are cheap or free. They happen underground where nobody can photograph them, and there is nothing to sell you. Nobody films an exciting advertisement about a cut-up bottle in a hole, but it grows a better clematis than anything in a shiny jug. Tell me in the comments if you have got a homemade watering trick. I want to steal the good ones. Now the second rung of the ladder, and here we start talking flowers, because tricks 3 through 7 are all one idea, and that idea is the biggest, most underused lever you own. It is not something you pour. It is the way you arrange the stems with your own 2 hands. Left alone against a wall, a clematis wants to shoot 1 or 2 stems straight up, flower in a little crown at the very top, and go bare and woody at the bottom. Within 3 seasons, you have a leggy thing with all its show up in the gutter and naked stems at eye level. Sound familiar? Why? Because in the wild, a clematis is a scrambler at the woodland edge, racing up through a shrub to reach the light. Straight up and fast is survival. Your garden is not a race, but the plant does not know that. So your whole job is to convince it that it has already won, that it can spread out and flower everywhere instead of sprinting for the sky. And it starts while the stems are young, soft, and green, because that is the only time they bend without snapping. Do not let those first stems bolt. Spread them out sideways, wide, like opening a fan or laying out the fingers of your hand, and tie them low and wide across your support. You are drawing the shape of the whole future plant right now, while it is still soft enough to teach. A stem you fan out wide will feed a wall of flowers. A stem you let run straight up will feed a chimney. Trick 4 is the support that makes Trick 3 possible, and there are two halves, one about shape, one about a detail, so small most people never figure out why their clematis will not climb at all. First, shape. To fan stems out wide and low, give them horizontal wires. Simple galvanized wire run across your wall or fence in rows, the lowest near the ground and the rest stepped up about 18 inches apart. Horizontal, not a single pole, because horizontal is the direction we want the plant thinking in. The Royal Horticultural Society recommends exactly this fan of wires, and it is what the good old walled gardens have used for a century. Now the detail that quietly ruins so many clematis. It does not have sticky pads like ivy, or wrap its whole stem like a bean. It climbs with its leaf stalks. The thin little stems holding each leaf reach out, brush something skinny, and curl around it. The key word is skinny. A clematis leaf stalk can only grip something about as thick as a pencil, a quarter of an inch or so, no more. So chunky wooden slats or fat posts. The plant physically cannot hold on. It reaches, finds nothing to grab, and slides back down. That is not a weak plant. That is a plant on the wrong furniture. Give it wire, twine, or netting, something pencil thin, and watch it grip and go. We did a whole video on that climbing habit, so I will not go long. But if your clematis is flopping and refusing, this is very often the entire reason. Trick 5 is free, takes 10 seconds, and goes against every nervous bone in your body, because it means pinching off perfectly good growth on purpose. But it is one of the surest ways to turn one stem into 6. Here is the mechanism, and it runs the whole flower story, so learn it once. The very tip of a growing stem is in charge. It makes a hormone. Auxin is the name, but you do not need it. And that hormone flows down and tells every bud below, stay asleep, I have got this. That is why an untouched clematis runs and runs on 1 or 2 stems and hardly branches. The tip is bossing everyone into silence. So when a young shoot has put on a few sets of leaves, pinch out the soft growing tip between finger and thumb. The moment you do, that signal is cut, and the buds below wake up. Where you had 1 growing tip, you get 2, 3, sometimes 4 side shoots. Pinch those when they have grown, and each branches again. You are not slowing the plant, you are trading a little height for a lot of stems, and every stem is future flowers. Do this 2 or 3 times through spring on a young or leggy plant, and by summer you have a bushy, many-armed clematis, instead of a bolted single whip. It is the same trick that makes a pinched basil go bushy, or a chrysanthemum come thick with bloom. Same hormone, same result. Costs nothing. Sold by no one. Alright, number 6. The one I told you to wait for, and the reason this video exists, because when it clicked for me, it changed how I grow every climbing thing I own. It is completely free, it feels wrong the first time, and it is the single most powerful flower lever there is. Take your longest, strongest stems and bend them down. Not up, down, toward horizontal. Here is why it works, and it is beautiful once you see it. Remember that boss hormone from the tip, telling all the buds below to stay asleep? That signal depends on the stem pointing up. Straight up, the tip is king, and the whole length stays blind and budless while the action races to the top. But the plant reads gravity. Bend that same stem over sideways, toward level, and the tip loses its throne. The signal breaks down along the arch, and every bud that was sleeping suddenly gets the message, the top is gone, wake up, your turn. And they do. A stem that would have carried a few flowers at its tip breaks into shoots and buds along its whole length. You do not get a flower at the top. You get a wall of flowers down the entire arm. This is not a clematis quirk. It is the oldest secret in the orchard, exactly why they bend fruit tree branches down flat for more apples. and why a climbing rose trained sideways along a fence drips with roses when the same rose sent up a pole gives you a bloom or two at the tip. Bend the stem, break the tip's rule, wake the whole length. So take your fanned-out leaders and arch them over. Guide them along your horizontal wires. Tie them so they run sideways, or even dip a little at the end. Do it gently, while they still have give, with soft ties that never cut the stem. Come flower time, you will not believe the same plant did that. People swear they bought a new clematis. They just stopped letting it point at the sky. This is the honest heart of the whole video. Nobody can put this in a bottle. It is a bend of the wrist and a piece of twine, and it beats every bloom booster on the shelf, which is exactly why you had to come to an old gardener to hear it. So tell me in the comments, have you ever bent a stem down on purpose? Or did you, like me, spend years tying everything straight up and wondering why the flowers hid at the top? Trick 7 is the hardest thing I will ask of you all day, and on a brand new plant it feels almost cruel. So let me make the case. A young clematis is usually 1 or 2 long, thin, eager stems in a pot, and your every instinct is to let them run. Do not. That first spring after planting, unless it already has 3 or 4 stems from the base, cut it down hard, to about a foot from the ground, just above a strong, fat pair of buds. Yes, you are cutting off most of the plant you just paid for. Do it anyway. Here is the trade, and it is the same branching logic, done with the shears. 1 tall, thin whip, left alone, gives you 1 tall, thin plant forever, bare at the bottom. Cut low, and it is forced to push several new stems up from the base, right where you want them. You trade this 1 season's height, which you will not miss for long, for a plant that comes back 3, 4, 5 stemmed, full from the ground up, for the next 20 years. The Royal Horticultural Society gives exactly this advice, and the University Extension folks say the same. Sleep, creep, leap. Year 1 it sleeps and makes roots. Year 2 it creeps. Year 3 it leaps. That hard first cut makes sure that when it leaps as a full plant, not a bare pole. We have a whole video on pruning by group and that first year cut, so I will keep it short. But if you do one brave thing to a young clematis, this is the one that pays. Now down onto the 3rd rung, the living soil, starting with the trick the other videos treat like a magic potion. Alfalfa. I am going to give you the honest version, because honest is more useful than the hype, and honest is what this channel is for. The claim you hear alfalfa holds a natural growth stimulant, you sprinkle it around, and the plant takes off like you flipped a switch. Here is what is true. There really is a compound in alfalfa called triacontanol. It really is a plant growth regulator. It was discovered in alfalfa back in 1977 by a researcher named Stanley Rees, and his team published in the journal Science. All real, I will not take it from you, but here is what the salesman leaves out. Those studies were on rice, corn, and tomatoes, not clematis. There is not one study showing a clematis reacts to it dramatically, and in a real garden bed the effect is famously hit or miss, because it depends on the dose, and a handful scattered on the ground is not a measured dose. So no, alfalfa is not a magic switch. So why still use it? Because it works for a plainer, sturdier reason, the one this whole channel is built on. Alfalfa meal is roughly 2 to 3% nitrogen and loaded with organic matter. Scratch a couple of handfuls into the soil in spring, and it does not feed the plant directly. It feeds the living soil. The microbes and fungi swarm it, break it down, and release a slow, gentle stream of nitrogen right at the roots. That is not a switch. That is a good meal for the soil food web, and a well-fed soil grows a strong clematis. The growth regulator part is a nice maybe on top. The soil feeding part is the real gold, and that is why we say, feed the soil, not the plant. Trick 9 is the faster-acting cousin of Trick 8, and I will warn you now, it stinks, gloriously. But your clematis has no nose and loves the stuff, so here is the recipe. Take a big handful of plain alfalfa pellets, the kind sold as animal feed, a few dollars for a sack that lasts a year, and drop them in a 5-gallon bucket of water. Then wait 3 or 4 days, maybe a week in warm weather, stirring when you pass. The pellets swell into a thick, brown, frankly evil-smelling brew. Keep a lid on it, downwind of the porch, because your family will have opinions. Then pour it, watered down, about half tea and half water, around the base, into that pipe from trick 2, if you put one in. You have made a liquid version of that soil meal, but now the nutrients are already broken down and available, so the roots and soil life get at them fast. A couple of times through spring and early summer, and you will often see fresh shoots push where there were none. One honest note and one safety note. Honest, this is not a miracle. It is good food. It works because it feeds a living soil. Safety, keep feeding to the growing half of the year and ease off by late summer, because you do not want to push tender new growth right before the frosts come and burn it. Everything in its season. Now, some of you grew up with a grandmother who swore by a bucket of something rotten out behind the shed. Tell me in the comments what was in hers. Half the best tricks I know came off somebody's grandmother. Trick 10 is for anyone who has stood in the garden aisle holding a bottle that promises more flowers and wondered if there was another way. There is, and it grows in a corner of the yard for free. Comfrey. Let me be careful and honest, the way I promised. Comfrey has a long reputation among old organic gardeners as a potassium plant, a so-called dynamic accumulator whose deep roots mine minerals and stack them in its leaves. Some of that reputation is more tradition than hard laboratory proof, and I will not dress up folklore as settled science. But this part is solid. Comfrey leaves really are rich in potassium, and potassium is the nutrient most tied to flowering and sturdy growth. So the old practice has a real backbone. How to use it? Plant one comfrey, just one, and choose the sterile kind called Bocking 14, so it does not seed itself all over creation and become a nuisance. Through summer, cut armfuls of the big leaves. Lay them straight down as mulch around the clematis, where they rot fast and hand their potassium to the soil. Or rot a bucketful in water, like the alfalfa tea, another gloriously foul brew, and pour that around the roots. One firm safety line, because it matters. Comfrey is for your plants, never for you. Do not brew a tea you drink. Do not eat it. It contains compounds that are hard on the human liver, and the old books that recommended eating it had it wrong. In the garden bed, feeding your clematis, it is a wonderful free source of the exact nutrient that drives bloom. You grew your own flower food, no bottle involved, and nobody made a cent. Starting to see the pattern? Trick 11 is the one place on this whole ladder where I point you at something you actually buy. And notice how far down we had to come before I did. Liquid seaweed. Kelp. Here is why this one earns its spot when the flashy bloom boosters do not. Seaweed is barely a fertilizer. It has almost no nutrients, and if you bought it expecting a feed, you would be disappointed. What it has instead is a suitcase full of natural plant hormones, cytokinins, auxins, and others. The plant's own signaling chemicals, concentrated by the ocean. This is real, and it is in the research. Work in journals of plant growth has found those hormones in kelp extracts and tied them to sturdier roots, better tolerance of heat and stress, and a plant that bounces back faster after a hard spell. So think of seaweed as a tonic, not food. A little confidence for a stressed plant. A newly planted clematis in its first hot summer, or one recovering from that hard cut, gets a real lift from a watering can with a capful stirred in every couple of weeks. But let me keep myself honest, because that is our deal. This is a helpful tonic, not a transformation. It is real, it is modest, and it belongs down here on the 11th rung, nowhere near as powerful as the free bend of a stem back at number 6. Tight budget? Skip it and go pull the levers up top. A few dollars and a struggling young plant? It is money better spent than almost anything else on that shelf. Read the label, follow the dilution, and do not imagine more is better. It is not. Trick 12 is where I show you the part of your garden you cannot see, because there is a whole second root system waiting to hook up to your clematis, for the price of a barrow of mulch and the discipline to leave the soil alone. Down in healthy soil live fungi called mycorrhizae, and they do something that sounds made up, but is one of the best documented partnerships in nature. Their threads, far finer than any root, weave into a plant's roots and spread out through the soil for feet in every direction, bringing back water and phosphorus and minerals the plant could never reach on its own. And in return, the plant pays them in sugar. It is a trade older than the dinosaurs. For your clematis, a good fungal partner is like bolting on a second root system, many times the size of the one it grew itself. So how do you get it? Two things. One you do, one you stop. The thing you do? Mulch. Lay a couple of inches of wood chips, leaf mold, or compost over the root zone each year, kept pulled back a hand's width from the stems so the crown stays dry. That mulch is not just a blanket, it is groceries. The soil life eats it from below, and a well-fed fungal network is a big one. The United States Department of Agriculture's soil health people will tell you, keep the ground covered and fed, and the underground economy thrives. The thing you stop is just as important. Stop digging around the roots. Every turn of that soil rips the fungal threads apart. And go easy on high phosphorus fertilizers, the big middle number on the bag. Because, and this surprises people, a plant swimming in phosphorus stops bothering to feed its fungi, and the partnership withers. So the move is almost lazy. Feed the surface, leave the soil be, and let a network you will never see grow your clematis roots you could never buy. Trick 13 is the famous old rule, and I want to fix the way it usually gets taught, because the common version can work against you. You have heard it. Clematis likes its head in the sun and its feet in the shade. That part is true. A root zone that bakes dry and hot is a stressed plant. And a stressed plant, as we keep learning today, hits the brakes instead of growing. So far, so good. But then people reach for the usual fix, a big flat stone or paver laid over the roots. And here is my quibble. Gardener to gardener, a stone in full sun does not stay cool. It soaks up heat all afternoon and radiates it right back down into the soil, holding the warmth into the night. You wanted a cool basement and built a warm griddle. There is a better way that does 3 jobs at once. Plant something low and leafy right at the clematis's feet. A low hardy geranium, some catmint, a mounding perennial, whatever you love. That living ground cover shades the soil the way a stone never can, because leaves stay cool while they work. It hides the bare bottom stems. And here is the part that ties back to everything. Those companion roots pump sugar into the soil, feeding the very same fungal network we just talked about. A stone feeds nothing. A living plant feeds the whole underground table. We went deeper on cool feet in another video, so just take the one upgrade. Swap the hot stone for a living skirt of plants. Trick 14 is the easiest thing on the whole list, because it is a thing you do not do. And yet impatient gardeners break it the most, myself included, back when I knew less. A clematis hates having its roots disturbed. It puts enormous effort into a deep, careful root system, wraps that system into the fungal network we talked about, and when you dig it up and move it, or even dig hard around it, you tear all of that apart. The plant does not just pause. It goes back to square one and starts rebuilding, and you can lose a full year or 2 of progress in one afternoon of good intentions. So here is the discipline. Choose the spot carefully once, and mean it. Then leave it alone. Do not move it because it looks sad in year 1. Year 1 is supposed to look sad. It is busy underground. Do not dig bulbs and annuals in, right on top of the crown every spring. Do not cultivate the soil around the base to tidy it. The most productive thing you can do for an established clematis is often to walk past it and keep your shovel in the shed. This is the quiet truth under half of good gardening. A lot of what looks like a green thumb is really just patience and restraint. The plant knows how to grow. Your job is to set it up right and get out of its way. We have a whole video on getting that first placement right, because you only choose once for free. And here we are at the bottom rung, trick 15. Save for last on purpose, because this is the one the rest of the world puts first. The foliar spray. The bottle you missed onto the leaves that promises to feed your plant and explode it into bloom. Let me tell you plainly what the research says, so you can walk past that shelf with a clear head. A leaf is built to catch sunlight and breathe, not to eat. It can take in a little nutrient through its surface, genuinely useful for one specific job. A trace mineral shortage like iron, where a tiny amount fixes it. But for the big nutrients that actually build a plant, the nitrogen, the potassium that grows stems and drive flowers, a leaf can only absorb a trickle. The Alabama Cooperative Extension puts it at somewhere around 15 to 20% of what you spray even getting in, and the rest drips off or burns. University trials on feeding major nutrients through the leaves have come back, over and over, with very little to show. The plant scientists at Washington State University went so far as to call foliar feeding for general growth a myth. The big nutrients have to come up through the roots. There is no shortcut through the leaves. So think about what that means. The most heavily advertised product in the whole clematis growing world sits right here, dead last, on the weakest rung. And the strongest things, the deep soak, the bent stem, the fed soil, the fungal network, the pinch of a tip, are all free, all in your hands, and not one has an advertisement, because you cannot package a bend of the wrist. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody is out to get you. It is just the plain economics. The powerful things here are invisible and unsellable, so no company spends money teaching them, which means the only place you will hear them is from another gardener, across the fence, with dirt under their nails. That is what I am for. So there is your ladder, top to bottom. Water deep so the roots dive, and send that water down a pipe to where they live. Fan the young stems wide on thin wire they can actually grip. Pinch them to branch, and then, the big one, bend them down toward level, and turn one flowering tip into a whole wall of bloom. Cut a young plant hard once to build its base. Feed the soil, not the plant. With alfalfa and its smelly tea, grow your own potassium in a comfrey patch. Add a splash of seaweed if you like, and mulch to raise a fungal network that becomes a second set of roots. Keep the feet cool with living plants, not a hot stone. Then leave the poor thing alone and let it get on with it. The spray bottle comes last, if at all. You do not have to do all 15 this weekend. Pull the top few levers, water, the bend, the fed soil, and you will see this plant change in a single season. Stack them all over a couple of years, and you will have the clematis, the neighbors slow down to look at. One last honest word to carry with you. Every plant has its own local weather, soil, and hardiness zone. And one clematis, the sweet autumn kind, has turned invasive in parts of the country. So know what you are planting before you plant it. When you choose a variety or reach for any product, check with your local extension office and know your zone. They are free, they are local, and they know your dirt better than any video can. And wear your gloves when you prune, because clematis sap can irritate the skin and keep the trimmings away from curious pets and grandchildren, since the plant is mildly toxic if anyone takes a bite. If this helped you see that plant differently, if you are looking out the window at it right now thinking, I have been growing it upside down, then do an old gardener a kindness and subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from. And tell me below which lever you are pulling first. I am betting on number 6. Now go on out there and give that vine something to do. I will see you by the garden bed next time.